Okay, so thank you everyone for being here today for our last seminar of the semester. It is our pleasure to welcome Pamela Jakiela from Williams College to tell us about this work on a firm of one's own, experimental evidence on credit constraints and occupational choice. So the floor is yours, Pamela. Please go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much. I hope you all can hear me okay. Let me start with a couple of caveats. So this is, as I was saying earlier, this is my first Zoom proper seminar. So hopefully you'll bear with me. And I should say this is joint work with Owen Osier, my colleague here at Williams, and Andrew Brudevold Newman and Maddalena Onorati at the World Bank. So I probably don't need to motivate this work that much in this audience, but let me just start by saying that youth underemployment and unemployment is a major issue in many developing countries, but particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And so you can see here a little bit about the age distribution of the population in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and East Asia and Pacific. Sub-Saharan Africa is unique in that it's the region in the world where total fertility has really not declined substantially yet. And so we still see this kind of population pyramid, which means that while many regions in the world are sort of struggling with underemployment and unemployment, particularly among youth entering the labor market, it's really acute in sub-Saharan Africa because the number of youth entering the labor market continues to grow quite rapidly with every cohort. And so Dion Filmer and Louise Fox have done a bunch of descriptive work looking at this problem and sort of documented how youth entering the labor market often have to spend kind of 5 to 10 years looking for a first position that gets their foot in the door before they can find kind of regular gainful, I shouldn't even say employment, but a regular gainful way of generating an income for their family, either through self-employment or through formal or informal paid work. And, with the possible exception of, the last year, the economy of sub-Saharan Africa has actually been growing quite rapidly, but the formal sector in particular is still quite small. And so even with relatively high rates of growth, there's no way for formal sector jobs to provide an adequate number of opportunities for the youth entering the labor market. And so a lot of youth entering the labor market are only going to be able to find work in agriculture or in some form of own account work, self-employment. And so when we think about the types of interventions that are appropriate in this context, often these are interventions that are going to promote self-employment because even with a lot of growth in the formal sector and the informal private sector, there simply aren't enough jobs available. So we can think about a range of active labor market programs that can be used to try to address these issues of youth underemployment. Many of these are not mutually exclusive, but so we can think about kind of skills training, building human capital, particularly job-specific human capital. We can think about matching services and things trying to eliminate frictions in the labor market, which are kind of more common in settings where the overall supply of jobs tends to be higher. And then in many African settings, we think primarily about different types of entrepreneurship promotion programs. So either credit market interventions, microfinance, or just straight up capital grants, or vocational education, or increasingly education not so much focused on business skills, but focused on overall life skills that might be needed to start businesses. And so there are important questions about which of these work. So we don't have a great sense of which policies work overall, what they achieve, and which work best in different contexts. So it's pretty clear, increasingly clear, that cash grants alone can be very important for poverty alleviation and for individual well-being. But whether both grants and loans alone are sufficient to start to help unemployed individuals or underemployed individuals start businesses that are actually profitable is more of an open question. And it's particularly open, the evidence is particularly mixed when it comes to women. So there are relatively few examples of cases where grants or loans to women who do not already have businesses have led to sustained increases in income generation over time. So there's sort of more positive evidence on the impacts of grants and loans and straight credit market interventions is found when we think about things that target more highly selected entrepreneurs. So business plan competitions, things like that, that target those people who already have businesses have been shown to be effective in a number of cases. But the evidence that there's a credit market failure that is alone preventing women in particular who are outside of the labor market from starting profitable businesses is pretty unclear. There's some more positive evidence recently of kind of packaged interventions, so interventions that are addressing multiple market failures and multiple things that are lacking from unemployed youth's resumes or skill sets at the same time. And so programs like BRAC's Adolescent Girls Club that are building life skills and self-confidence while also working to give you capital and business training, programs like this have been shown to increase self-employment and income and empowerment in different contexts. So what I'm going to be talking about today is an evaluation in 3 very poor neighborhoods in Nairobi that's trying to tease apart some of these issues. So it's an evaluation that we did in partnership with the International Rescue Committee, or IRC. And it's an evaluation of their program that they called Girls Empowered by Microfranchise. And so the idea of microfranchising is that it's one of these packaged interventions where you have a number bundled interventions where you have a number of different pieces operating at once. So the microfranchising model, as the name suggests, connects unemployed or underemployed youth with branded businesses. They're kind of small business kits. So it's like microcredit in the sense that it is encouraging participants to set up individual, very small businesses, but it's giving you exactly what the business should be, and you can choose among a menu of different opportunities. And so you don't have to have that kind of market intelligence that you need to identify a profitable business opportunity. And then the participants in that program are going to receive business-specific training, business-specific capital, supply chain linkages, mentoring, a whole bunch of things that are intended to try to really help participants start this very specific business in their community. And then it also gave them broader life skills training, coaching, et cetera, to try and overcome the non-human capital obstacles to starting a business. So what we're going to do is we're going to compare applicants for this program, who are going to be young women aged 18 to 19 in Nairobi. We're going to randomly assign them to either the program, a control group, or a group that got pure cash grants. And so we have this sample of applicants who did pass some minimal screening. They're from 3 very poor neighborhoods in Nairobi, and they're going to be assigned to one of these 2 treatments or to the control group. And so individuals in the franchise group were then they were invited to participate in the IRC's microfranchising program. Another set of individuals were instead asked if they were interested in receiving a grant that was approximately equal in value to the cost of the microfranchising program. So instead of getting this bundled intervention that was working on multiple margins and addressing human capital constraints, just being given the capital alone without any other packages of services. And we're going to be following up these women 1, 2, and 5 years approximately after treatment to try and trace out the longer, at least medium run impacts of being assigned to these programs early in your professional life.
Can I interrupt? Is there?
Yes, of course.
No, on these different sizes for the different treatment groups, is there any reason why you have less in the grant group, or
yes.
money or anything?
Yes, money.
But it could be by design or anything.
Yeah. No, so this is a very prosaic story. So we applied to the IZA to get funding for this evaluation, and we had been interested in trying to unpack some of the components and had kind of worked with IRC on thinking about that, and it was clear it wasn't going to be feasible. And the IRC, as many of us have experienced, had committed to provide the program to a certain number of women to their donors. And so they had minimum constraints on how many people needed to be in that group. But IZA came to us and said, we'd really like it if you could unpack something more than just does this program work or not. And their suggestion was just a straight cash grant, which we thought was a great idea. So then the cash grant was actually funded by IZA. So we had a fixed amount of money to do that, and then administered separately from the IRC's program. So I think the short answer, I mean, there was a money constraint. The short answer was just how many people could be left over after we had, after we'd met the IRC's limits for what fraction of the girls needed to be enrolled in their program. And we thought it didn't make sense to underpower the control group, because then our comparison of control versus the franchise intervention would be weakened.
Of course.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Okay.
I'm sorry, can I just jump in with a quick question?
Please
to make sure I'm understanding the what the treatment entails. So like the franchise treatment, is it a branded thing? Is it associated with like existing companies, or is it just kind of—
Wayne?
Yeah.
Can I just stop you and come back in like 5 to 8 minutes?
Please, perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay. So I'm just going to skip through some of this. So the short version of this slide is that a lot of evaluations of these types of active labor market interventions and cash grants are very short term. So looking at the impact 6 or 12 months after treatment. And you know, there are many, many reasons to do short-term evaluations, but in this case, and as we, you know, since we started working on this paper, a few other papers have come out showing this, it's pretty clear that interventions that have big effects in the short term may or may not lead to persistent changes. And of course, if we think there's some poverty trap that these grants are overcoming, then we would expect changes to persist and if anything, get bigger over time. Whereas if we think that people are basically spending down their grant, or this is some short-term substitute, then we might think that effects are going to disappear over time. And so, you know, I'm going to be looking, I should say, just, you know, this is a pretty standard RCT talk. The one thing I'm going to say is I'm going to look first at impacts on labor market outcomes, and then after we get a sense of what those are, we'll be talking a bit more on overall impacts on well-being. And at the end, if there's time, I'm going to talk about how we measured participants' beliefs about the impact of the program. So just to give you a preview of the findings, we're going to see that both of these treatments are going to shift women into self-employment, and that these effects are going to be extremely persistent. So not all the women, it's a modest fraction of the women who get moved into self-employment, but it seems as though, at least over the 5-year horizon, that transition is basically permanent. We see short-term impacts on income in the first year, and they're going to disappear over time, and it's pretty clear that those are gone. And then the interesting thing that we learned in the 5-year follow-up is that basically this multifaceted program seems to have some small positive effects on the overall well-being of the women assigned to it, whereas the cash grants actually seem to have small negative effects. And when we compare those two treatments, even though they're both shifting women into self-employment, it seems like the women who got the bundled program are significantly better off than the women who received just the cash grant without this other package of support. And so we think that's a little bit of a kind of, caveat about the general sense that cash grants are as good as any intervention, that it does seem like this more supportive and cohesive program shifted women's view about what they were doing, possibly their identity, in ways that then led to longer term impacts on well-being. Okay, so let me now come back to the research design and the nature of the intervention. So this is an intervention in Kenya. This is my, when I present this to non-development audiences. So this is in 3 neighborhoods in Nairobi, Dandora, Lunga, and Dogo. These are, so if you know anything about Nairobi, these are kind of out east of town. Some of these are bordering on industrial areas. Some of these are bordering on the Mathare slum that is out here. These are very poor neighborhoods, mixed kind of slum and light industrial areas. And so the intervention, as I've said, is women who are aged 18 to 19 were invited to apply to this program. And just to kind of come back to Wayne's question, the key distinction between this intervention and other labor market interventions is this very particular focus on specific franchise brands. So this is something that the IRC had gotten very excited about, with the idea that what they did is they worked with a few different kind of local business consultants to identify market holes that were things that a young woman aged 18 to 19 could feasibly, safely do as far as a business. And so they identified a few different business models that they then piloted. And for each of these business models, and I'll talk specifically about them in a second, for each of these business models, they matched the participants with a specific brand that wanted to expand in these markets, in these neighborhoods. And so they got franchise-specific training, franchise-specific capital, and then everyone who participated got this business and life skills training and ongoing mentoring from community-based organizations working in these areas. So the two businesses, there were two main business models. They tried a third solar lantern business that didn't really ever function. So there were only one or two people who did that one. But the main business models were training to open your own hair salon, which you see here. So this was in partnership with a very large maker of hair notions, so the things that you braid into your hair. And they wanted to expand sales of these in these neighborhoods. And the way to do that is to set up salons. And so, as you're probably aware, many African women go every week or two to have their hair re-braided and have different things braided into their hair, added to their hair. And so there's this kind of constant level of demand for salons that are going to put these products into your hair that then stay for the week. And so the women who did this program, they did a 6-week short course in the training center of this maker of hair notions, and then they did 2 weeks in an existing salon, kind of an apprenticeship, and then they were helped to launch their own very, very small scale salons. And so you can see when I say very small scale salons, like this woman here, she's in a tiny wrought iron hut on the side of a road, and she just has a chair in there that she has her customers sit on when she's braiding their hair. The other business model is these carts selling smoked chicken sausages. And so this is a bit of a very Kenya specific. In Kenya, everywhere you go, in Nairobi, there are these carts selling pork sausages. And then there's a pretty well-known Kenyan brand that produces chicken products and has chicken restaurants. And they thought it would be exciting to have chicken sausages compete in the market with the pork sausages. And so they started promoting these chicken sausage carts. And so the women who did this business model were set up with these relatively high value pieces of capital, these carts that could be used to keep sausages warm and also cool. And then they could add to that any other sorts of food that they were selling. So they basically received these mobile food carts and were set up with supply chain linkages for different food products and became mobile food sellers. Wayne, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, like, what's in it for the brands? And I think the way you've set it up makes it very clear, like there's product to push here. And so like, it definitely makes sense to me why the brands are interested in this. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, the one thing I would say, which is, again, not a surprise working in developing country contexts is, I mean, there is a very clear motivation for these brands that these are neighborhoods that it's a little bit difficult for traditional, particularly brick and mortar, but just traditional large firms to penetrate. Now, I think penetration into these neighborhoods, clearly there's some risk here of distilling the brand's value if some of these products are of low quality, but that seems not to be a particular concern to these firms in this setting. So they have given the participants in the program a huge amount of leeway to promote the brand while, with relatively minimal vetting of the overall quality. So I think franchise doesn't necessarily have exactly the same connotations of the firm vetting the quality that it might in the United States or in the European Union or something. But for the brands, I think there is this incentive that these are difficult to penetrate markets that they're trying to get into.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes, of course.
So I was wondering, whether, I mean, under this design, there is a way to disentangle the role of franchise. So do you know ex ante how important is this brand?
Yeah. So
how
the
known?
short answer is no. So we tried to, a thing that we toyed with was basically asking whether we could we initially thought about randomizing which franchise you got. And the IRC, I think quite rightly, was like, no, everybody gets their first choice. And so everybody got their first choice. And I think, there's a more general caveat that is true of almost all RCTs, as we know, but I think is very true here, that when we are evaluating this franchise intervention, it's a very specific mix of which franchises were there, and also very specific to these businesses and these market conditions. And so I think one of the things that stands out to us is that in the short term, at least, when we think about the labor market impacts, the impacts are so strikingly similar to the impacts of the cash grants that gives us some faith that these are not just very specific to these interventions. But I think, all sorts of caveats about external validity are valid here, and that an evaluation of a business training program is very specific to the types of businesses that people choose to start. I mean, and that's also true with a cash grant, depending on what people choose to do in any given market. But I think it's very salient here that we're directing people into a particular set of businesses. And if those businesses were more or less successful, that could lead to different impacts.
But just an additional, so were people aware that these were successful models? Or they are just, they do, just what is the experience ex ante of them with this type of models?
I mean, so I think the question of whether these are successful models for these women is what we are here to evaluate today. In terms of, are these successful businesses? So if you have ever been to Nairobi, you will know that there are hair salons everywhere, that there is a huge amount of demand for these services. And so one of the things that we did that I'm not going to be able to present today is basically try to look at whether there were spillovers onto other businesses in these sectors. And the striking thing is how incredibly dense with hair salons Nairobi is. And this is not just oversaturation. This is because particularly on weekends when women who have regular jobs aren't in the office, there's just an incredible amount of demand for people to be doing hair. And so I think that the salon definitely is a successful business model. And then I think also these kind of mobile food carts are seen all over Nairobi. They're seen all over the developing world. So the general principle, are these workable business models? I think that's quite clear. They're quite familiar to all of the participants. Whether these particular brands, whether this exact model works out for the women, I think we can look at what the data show us.
Can I ask a related question?
Sure.
It seems that a big part of the success of this model is about establishing or identifying which businesses can play a role in this process. Can you tell us a little more about that? I mean, was it easy to find about these businesses, to establish the partnerships, to get them going and participate in this process? I'm also thinking in terms of potentially applying this model in other contexts. Maybe labor demand is a little bit less strong there. So would there be specific steps one could take to try to establish the partnerships?
Yeah, and so, I mean, I will say that the IRC, so I had been working with the IRC to try to put together an evaluation of this program for a while. So we'd actually almost done an evaluation in Sierra Leone. And I am still upset about this because there the business was an ice delivery firm that delivered ice on bicycles, and it was called Ice Ice Baby. So I'm very disappointed. I never got to write a paper about Ice Ice Baby. But I think, this is something that we were not involved in. So the IRC came to us having worked with different local consultants to try to identify these business models. And I'll say that they had several. The three that they were the most excited about were these two, and then this solar lantern business that just never really worked because the lanterns were too expensive and there was no demand for them. And so I think that there's an art to figuring out what the businesses are. And I'm not sure I have any, I have seen this work, and I think that you can see things that seem promising, but there isn't like a precise science to doing it, as far as I can tell. I mean, I would say that it was pretty clear throughout that there was a lot of enthusiasm about these businesses. It is interesting because most of the women, more than half the women in our sample do the salon business. There's a huge amount of interest among these women in starting a salon. And one of the things that was most interesting to me is that even among women who started a salon and then closed it because it didn't work, we did focus groups with them a year later. And you ask them what they are aspiring to do, they're aspiring to open a salon. So I think that the preference for a particular type of job, even in the face of kind of it not working in a particular type of sector, is very strong. So I think the biggest lesson that I would say is that you need to kind of start with not just what is missing in the market, but also what is it that the participants see themselves as doing, and try to find the match between those two things. Because
could there be some potential contamination of the control group, in the sense that these businesses, they were going to expand anyway to some extent, and because the project came along, the resources were directed to the treatment group, so some women that otherwise would have participated were left out? Or
I think no. So we haven't seen any other, I mean, this is a pretty uncommon, like, we haven't seen other examples of firms doing exactly this. There are, there are other jobs available, and so every now and then a firm gets an idea like this. But I think for these firms in particular that have pretty high, with the food carts, it's a large value capital item, and with the salons, they do have to do 2 months of training. And so I think that sort of thing is something that would not have been possible without frankly, a large subsidy from foundations to promote the screening and human capital building of the participants in the program.
Yeah, so real quick, Pam, can I just build on that?
Yes, but I think you do all want to see the results. So I just want to point out that fact.
Okay, you go ahead. I'll ask my question later if relevant.
Okay. So the grant treatment, women assigned to the grant treatment received an unrestricted transfer of $230. No direction to use it toward a business. So we were very open about, you should use this to make your life better in whatever way you see fit. And so if, of course, the binding constraint here is just that these women all want to start businesses and they don't have the access to credit that they need, then relaxing that constraint should be able to get them out of the poverty trap. But if we think about human capital, business intelligence, life skills, any other things being the binding constraint or one of the binding constraints, then credit alone isn't actually going to make the difference in terms of switching them into self-employment. And then, of course, the cash grant has a very high take-up rate. And so that's something we're going to keep in mind throughout. And the implementation costs were minimal. And so this sort of costed about as much per woman, but that cost was much more just capital handed over to the participants in that treatment. And so I've already showed you, we have these treatment arms. They're relatively balanced. The way we did this is we stratified by round of applications. So there were a number of waves, and we actually fingerprinted the applicants to make sure people weren't applying multiple times. And then within each round and neighborhood, we randomly assigned to treatment, all the usual stuff. So we have a few different sources of data. So we have a baseline survey that we did.
Just a small question.
Yeah.
Just a small question. Yeah, just for understanding. So the cash grant is meant to cover for capital. So these people could not open the franchise if they wanted to get the training with that cash grant.
They could not open the franchise. That's correct. They could not open the branded franchise. They could also open a salon or a mobile food cart, but they could not open the branded franchise.
But they could not pay for the training?
No.
Okay.
I mean, they could pay for other salon skills training, certainly, but they couldn't join this program or do it with this franchise partner.
So the cash grant is meant to cover also training, or, I mean,
if people wished. So, I mean, it was $230, which is enough to cover a short business training course like the one that the women in the franchise, in the salon business model did. But it's not enough to do a kind of a longer full year course in in any sort of vocational skills. But, you know, we were really open. We didn't want to be either nudging people or giving them a reason to misreport their use of the money. And so we were just like, look, you know, you can consume this, you can do whatever. And in the responses about how people spent the money, we did see that they were fairly honest. And so we had one woman who said, I just rented a really nice house and I lived in it for 3 months and then I ran out of money, so I had to leave. You know, it seemed like people were open about the things that they were using the money for.
Thank you.
Okay. So a few different rounds of data here. So we have a very, very short baseline survey that happened immediately before implementation, very kind of objective education, demographics, things like that. And then we have administrative data on the program participation in both of the treatment arms. And then we did a midline, an end line, and a 4 to 5 year follow-up. And in each of those cases, we had above 90%, below 10% attrition, and attrition is not correlated with treatment in any of these cases. So we did relatively well on that. Yeah. So I just want to, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on baseline statistics. I just want to flag 2 really salient things about this population. So the first is that when we talk about youth unemployment, you know, we're using this kind of ILO definition of youth that goes up to age 35. And so, you know, I can remember being age 35, and I can tell you I didn't really feel like I was a youth at that time. These women are really young. So these are 18 to 19-year-olds. They are out of secondary school. About half of them are still living with a parent. And the overwhelming majority of them are doing no income generating activity at baseline. And so this, we think, is a key difference with a lot of kind of youth interventions, in that if you're talking about a youth who is 27 and already married and has 2 kids, probably they've had to figure out some sort of income generating activities to support their family. These youth are really early on in their careers, and we think that's salient when we think about the persistence of some of these impacts, and that they haven't really gotten on a trajectory in terms of what their career is going to be yet. Okay, so a little bit about compliance. Compliance with the franchise training, about 60% of those assigned to treatment start the training, about 40% make it through the 2 months of training and actually launch a business. So that's pretty standard relative to other interventions of this type that involve free training programs. I think I have a citation to McKenzie and Woodruff on this on the next page. But this is important to bear in mind when we're comparing these 2 treatments, that they have very different take-up. And so we're going to be looking at intent to treat estimates. You can mentally, you know, multiply by 1.4 in your head to think about treatment on the treated. It's not clear which one of those is the most policy relevant, but it's worth bearing in mind that when we think about this, take-up is quite different across these populations. And then the other thing is just that there's very, very little slippage. So almost no one, you can see basically nobody was able to participate in a training that they, an arm that they weren't assigned to. Okay, so I've already said this. So we're going to have a pretty standard ITT specification throughout the paper. We have indicators for random assignment to the franchise and grant treatment. We have stratum fixed effects. I have a few different specifications. So we have specifications with and without controls. In our most recent version, we've been using Lasso to try to identify the best set of controls. And the main takeaway is that the controls don't really matter much. And so the controls are not going to influence what is significant and what is not. So let me summarize the impacts over the different time horizons on labor market outcomes first. So when we're looking at impacts on self-employment, so you can see here I've got 3 panels, and I'm going to talk through these figures. You're going to see a lot of figures that look very similar. So I'm going to talk through just to make sure these are clear. So we've got, can you see on the screen when I move this cursor around? Yeah, okay. So we've got the impacts after 1 year, after 2 years, and after 5 years. So here we're looking at the outcome of whether you are self-employed, and the blue bars are the franchise treatment, the green bars are the cash grant treatment. And so what you see on self-employment is that there are very similar impacts of these 2 treatments. So we saw that about 40% of women assigned to the franchise treatment launch a business, which is to say they sign a memorandum of understanding at the end of the program with IRC. So they get their capital, they start a business. By 1 year out, we have a treatment effect on self-employment that is kind of 10 to 12 or 10 to 15 percentage points. So the first thing we know is there are a bunch of women who launch a business and then close it very quickly. But we see this impact of kind of 10 to 15 percentage points from both of these treatments that is extremely durable over time. And so after 2 years and even after 5 years, we see these effects are really not changing at all. And so this looks like those women who are nudged into self-employment are in self-employment when they would not otherwise have been kind of for the long haul at this point. So now they're in their mid-20s, they're still self-employed. Okay, so you can see this in a regression framework. So I have in each of these figures, I've got the, so you've got the top panel is impacts after 1 year, after 2 years, and after 5 years. And these are regressions where we have a dummy for assignment to the franchise treatment and the grant treatment, and then a test of equality of those two treatments. And you can see here that these impacts on self-employment, these are p-values in square brackets, these impacts on self-employment are there, they're quite persistent, and they're quite stable over time.
Okay.
Yes.
Very quick question. I was a little surprised, maybe because I'm not in the field, that grant effect on sort of self-employment is so high. So there's a little bit of research showing, I mean, yeah, indicating that some of the time the use of these funds or these windfalls may not be necessarily in the most productive way. So I don't know if you were surprised or not, or if you'd like to comment on that or not.
I mean, I think we were surprised that the impacts on self-employment are so similar between this program and another program. So one thing to say here is that the recruitment, the screening into the sample selected women who said they wanted to start a business, right? So I think there is some selection there. And in particular, I mean, it seems like this is consistent with a model where kind of 1 in 10 people is actually really committed to being an entrepreneur. So I think part of your question is, are we surprised that it's so big? I don't even know. I mean, first of all, I've been looking at this result for 5 years, so hindsight bias and everything, but I'm not sure whether it's big or small, but it's clearly quite persistent. I think the second part of your question was whether people are using these grants for the most productive use. And at some level, I would say, I don't even know how to answer that question. Like, what does productive use mean? And, you know, we see, so just to give you a sense of some of the other things people are using them for, there's no treatment effect of the grant on girls' own vocational education or overall education. But we do see that there's a big treatment effect on, so a lot of girls are much more likely to have paid school fees for some member of their family other than their own child. So I think one thing that happens, that we know happens in these situations, is you get money and there's a lot of social pressure to share. We got kind of detailed descriptions of what the girls were using it on, and there were a fair number who were basically consuming it or giving it to members of their family. And so, I mean, I think 19-year-old girls living in slums don't necessarily have a huge menu of productive things they can invest in or even save securely. But I mean, I think we have very little way of knowing whether this is the most productive thing women could do with the money.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'm impressed that, you know, give a cash grant and you can go so much above the control condition in terms of the impact on self-employment. That's interesting.
Okay, so when we look at hours worked, we see also overall positive impacts. And I just want to kind of flag here, one interesting thing is that in the first year, you see that the impact of the grant treatment is, hours worked in self-employment. The impact of the grant treatment is about twice as large as that of the franchise treatment. So we see overall impacts on self-employment that are comparable, but impacts on hours that are much larger there, though that seems to disappear over time. So now I want to look at where is this change in self-employment coming from? And so in the top panel here, we have the overall likelihood that you're engaged in any income generating activity. And in the bottom panel, you have the likelihood that you're doing some form of employment or informal paid work for others. And so that you can see that, you know, these effects are suggestive, but not particularly statistically significant. So is it increasing the likelihood that you're doing any income generating activity? Maybe after 2 years, coefficients are always positive, but they're pretty close to zero. Is it decreasing the likelihood that you're doing paid work? Maybe in the very short term, though not, again, not statistically significant. And that reduction in the likelihood that you're doing paid work seems to be declining over time. And then what we can see here is that if we try to tease this apart a little bit more, on the top panel here, I have whether you are only self-employed, so self-employed and not simultaneously doing paid work. And in the bottom, I have whether you are self-employed and also doing paid work. And this is a bit more interesting. So you see that in the first couple of years, everything is going through the likelihood that you're only self-employed. And then at 5 years, that seems to have changed a little bit. Now, this is consistent with part of what we saw early on. In contrast, you know, if you read Poor Economics or whatever, there's this whole notion that poor, particularly poor women, are overly diversified for a variety of reasons, and they're not investing enough in any one sector. Now, the women in our sample aren't like that at baseline because they're unemployed. They're out of the labor market. And so over diversification is not an issue. And so you only see, as we get to 5 years, any evidence that actually decent numbers of people are doing both of these things at once. It seems like early on, these women have kind of one involvement in the labor market. And so there's very little impact on the likelihood that you have multiple businesses in the short term. When we look at income, yes.
Can I just ask a quick question? So the fact that you have a very low, so you basically have an attrition of less than 10% 5 years later, is it indication that you have a little bit of selection in the type of unemployed women that you have as part of the study?
No, it is an indication that we are awesome.
That's awesome.
No. So we actually started, what we at the time didn't realize was a pilot RCT that was much smaller 2 years before this study with the IRC. And then at that wave, we could only find 70% of the women. And we were like, this is terrible. This is a really mobile population. And so what are we going to do? And then one of my co-authors saw Pascaline Dupont giving a talk about her secondary school paper in Ghana, where they had just given people phones. And we couldn't give people phones, but we basically set up a system for everybody in the control group that if every 3 months we texted you and you texted back, we would send you like 50 shillings, some tiny amount of money. And we just kept doing that throughout. And so then if you changed your SIM card, you could text us, we would text you back 50 shillings for your new SIM card. So we'd have you in the database. So we had this database for everybody in all 3 treatment groups that we were just every 3 months being like, hey, do we still have your contact information? And then that meant that we had really good data on where people were. And in some cases, when we went to physically track them down to do the survey, we would still have to go out all over Kenya, but we just had really fresh contact information because we were keeping these links going in this population that was changing SIM cards and moving around quite regularly. I mean, and I think that this is a takeaway where 10 years ago, your basic model of how you found people, you were much more likely to be working with a rural population, and the starting assumption was rural households don't move around that much. Now, people are much more mobile, but they're also much more connected. And so the way to keep track of people is not to assume that you'll physically find them, but to maintain contacts with them on social media. And like people on our field team, like had Facebook contact information for some of the respondents. Like we had really good social media information that allowed us to keep in touch. And here it is relevant that they were 18 and 19 and not 49. So all of these girls, like they have phones, they're on WhatsApp, they have all of these ways of keeping in touch. So social media things, I don't even know what they are.
Do you have a statistic of what is the percentage of the ones that are doing this type of activities in a totally different location as the one they were in 5 years before?
I do, but I don't have it right at my fingertips. So we know where they are, whether they've moved. Yeah. I mean, most of them are still in Nairobi. So a lot of them have moved within Nairobi, but most of them are still around Nairobi. There were relatively few people who kind of left Nairobi to go back out to the countryside. Okay, so let me talk a bit about income. So income is very hard to get power on. It has, there's a whole growing literature on how terrible it is to measure treatment effects on income. You have a distribution that has, these very fat, long tails, but also has a lot of people at zero. So it can be very difficult to figure out what the appropriate transformation is here. So the first thing I just want to show you is CDFs. So we've got the gray is the control group, and the blue, again, is franchise, green is the cash grant. So after a year, you can see that there's some evidence that there's this treatment effect on income of being assigned to either of these two treatments, and they're pretty similar. You see that that is still there at the bottom of the distribution. At 2 years, though, it seems to be getting smaller, and then you can see that it's kind of gone completely by 5 years. There's maybe this tiny difference in the likelihood that you have exactly zero, but otherwise the CDFs track each other pretty well. So the other way that I'm going to show this is kind of poor man's distributional regression here. So all I've done is I have a series of dummies for whether your income is greater than or equal to the different percentiles of the income distribution in the control group. So I've got, so each of these is a regression of a dummy for is your income above the first percentile in the control group, second percentile, et cetera. These are the treatment effects of being assigned to the franchise treatment and the cash grant treatment. And so you can see after 1 year, we have these kind of effects on income. In particular, people are much more likely to be not at the very top of the control group distribution, but have a positive income that's above median. At 2 years, you can see this pattern is going away a little bit, and by 5 years, you can see it's gone completely. And I should say here, you're also seeing what fraction, so all these ones that are the same, these are the people who have zero income. So all the percentiles of the control distribution are the same. And so you can see that the fraction of the control group that has no income in a month is getting much smaller over time as these people get older and find ways to enter the labor market. So we can look at impacts on income. So after 1 year, 2 years, and 5 years, so this is inverse hyperbolic sine. You can see there are these marginally significant impacts. This is, I think, just Winsorizing, but I can't actually see the very top of my screen. So trimming the top 0.5% here. And these are all denominated in Kenyan shillings. So you can divide by about 100 to get back US dollars. And so I want to flag that you see these short-term impacts on income in the first year, but notice how much the control mean is growing over time. So a lot of what is happening here is that the people assigned to the control group have no choice but to wait for a job opportunity to come along. And so they're much more likely to have zero income, whereas the people who are able to start a business today start the business and immediately are earning something. Whereas you can see over time, the control group is much more likely to be entering the labor force and starting to do paid work for others. And so then the treatment effects are disappearing, but a lot of what's happening is in fact that you are substituting women from a thing that might have a higher average payoff or a lower average payoff. We can't actually nail that down for sure, but where you're going to have to wait a long time for a job, you give them the opportunity to start a job immediately, a self-employment activity immediately. Katya, yes.
This is not similar to the work on Give Directly by Blattman and co-authors, like on the long run effects, saying that there is this catch-up effect. So this, I'm looking at it and it looks similar.
Yeah, so it's not Give Directly, but their program in Uganda. Yeah, no, it is similar. So we didn't know they were going to find the same thing. But yeah, no, it's a similar pattern.
It's convincing. I mean, it's a positive comment that I'm trying to make here. It's
and I think that this
transitional effect, right?
Yeah, and I think it's partially reflecting this idea that if you have a population that either by reasons of age or in the Blattman setting, I think it's as much about being a post-conflict environment, but where basically a lot of people are out of the labor force, and then you're returning to some equilibrium or reaching some equilibrium where those distortions are less present, then you see this catch up happening. So yeah, we think that's true here, though, for a very different reason. Okay, so I've got 10 minutes. I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground.
You're fine. Just take your time.
So I'm just very briefly, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. So we wanted to look at treatment effect heterogeneity. And so we do it using one of these cool machine learning algorithms. And so we're using this causal tree technique that Susan Athey has been working on for some time. And so the idea is that you have a model for predicting just a variable called a regression tree, where basically you think about, let me just show you the graph, you think about searching over the variables that you can use to partition the sample step by step into smaller and smaller groups. And this is a machine learning approach to predicting an outcome. You can also do this, and it turns out you can do this once, and it has a bunch of biases. It has greater predictive power if you do this a lot of times and average your results. That's for just sort of a standard machine learning prediction problem. You can also do this to try to predict treatment effect heterogeneity. So basically trying to partition your sample to have a smaller and smaller mean squared error of the treatment effect. And so this is what is called a causal tree, and a causal forest is when you do this 1,000 times over and again to figure out which variables consistently predict treatment effect heterogeneity. And then you can do this in a way where you split the sample and split your branches of the tree in half the sample and predict in the other half of the sample. And this gives you something that is unbiased in expectation, called an honest tree. And so we do this. And the reason we do it is basically that there's a lot of interest in what might be predicting treatment effect heterogeneity here. And there are a few important policy questions, like do the women who are going to be most affected know that they're going to be most affected? And does that drive selection and take up in the program? And this is a really nice way of doing that in a way that is disciplined and algorithmic and not necessarily open to data mining and convincing yourself that I knew all along it was going to be grit that, you know, really mattered here and not something else. And there's a nice R package, so you can do it very easily. And so the short answer is we do this. Now we have a lot of outcomes variables. We have 2 treatments. We have 3 different rounds of data. And so I'll show you a couple panels here where we have 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, franchise treatment on top, a grant treatment on the bottom. And I've got the p-values in the upper left corners for the test of equality of the 10th and 90th percentiles of the treatment effects. And so the big takeaway here is that while some of these are a bit suggestive, there's not really strong evidence of treatment effect heterogeneity here. So when we look across the different outcomes, you know, they're upward sloping, but we can generally not reject that the lower treatment effects are different from the higher treatment effects. And so we don't see really strong evidence that there's treatment effect heterogeneity. The caveat here is that, as I told you at the beginning, we have a pretty brief baseline survey. And so you can only find treatment effect heterogeneity in the things that you've actually measured at baseline. And so what we see is that in terms of educational variables, demographics, like whether you had a kid, social network variables, most of those are not predicting a huge amount of treatment effect heterogeneity. I think if we could go back in time, we don't have good measures of preferences and beliefs before you started the treatment. And so I think it's possible there's heterogeneity there, but we have no way to capture it. But I think one thing that is interesting is that the thing that predicts take-up seems to be much more about the institution or the market. So it's stratum fixed effects that are predicting. So this is basically neighborhood interacted with when you applied. Those are the things that predict take-up. They're not individual girl characteristics, they're community-based organization market characteristics, and those do not predict treatment effect heterogeneity at all. And so it does look like the take-up here, it's interesting because you would think that, you know, in our kind of standard models, we would think that people would be selecting into treatment based on what the likely treatment effect is for them, but it's not, there's not a lot of strong evidence that that is the case. Okay, so I'm going to just briefly now go through, so we've seen there's sort of this pattern of results from labor market outcomes where we see that the impacts on self-employment are not enormous. So we're shifting about 1 in 10 women into self-employment, but it seems to be a very durable shift. And we see these short-term impacts on income, but those impacts seem to go away over time. So what I want to do now is to try to dig deeper into why we would see this pattern. And I'm going to if I have time, use two different pieces of evidence. So one is about subjective and some objective measures of overall welfare. And then the second is going to be about beliefs about the impact of the program. So let me start by looking at impacts on well-being. And so when we did our 2-year follow-up, we found pretty limited evidence. We were looking at a few different measures of well-being. So we had living conditions, and this is just an index of whether you have electricity from the Kenya Power and Lighting grid, whether you have piped water, whether you have a toilet or latrine in your home or compound, TV, phone, computer. We have a measure of food security. This is based on the Fanta. We have a measure of overall happiness, both now and in the future. This is the Cantrell Ladder of Life. And then in our 5-year follow-up, we also added just a straight up direct question like, are you better off than you were 6 years ago when you started this, before you applied to this program? At 2 years, we see relatively little evidence. And so I'm going to show you this for, again, the blue is the franchise treatment, the green is the grant treatment, and then the orange at the bottom is comparing the franchise treatment versus the grant treatment. Which I'll say we didn't look at until we saw the 5-year results. But what you can see is that, there's some suggestive evidence that we see more things to the right for franchise than grant, but basically nothing appeared to be significant at 2 years, sorry. When we come back and look at 5 years, we see that, so for food security, for current and future well-being, the franchise treatment, the women assigned to the franchise treatment seem to be better off. And for, in particular, overall living conditions, so assets, and whether you're much better off than 6 years ago, those assigned to the grant treatment seem to be significantly worse off. And when we compare the franchise treatment to the grant treatment, even though the impacts on labor market activities are very similar, we see that on all of these measures, basically, the women assigned to the franchise treatment seem to be significantly better off than the women who are assigned to the grant treatment. And so the one thing I want to say about this is that the most objective of these is the living conditions index. And there are some straight up living conditions, like do you have piped water, where it seems quite clear that there is a treatment effect on an objective outcome here. But I would note that a bunch of these are fairly subjective. So even food security, the standard measure for food security, has questions like, did you skip a meal? But it also has questions like, were you afraid you would not have enough to eat? And so in many of these measures, this is capturing some combination of your objective standard of living and your level of anxiety or satisfaction with your standard of living. Right, and so this is just summarizing this. And so, yeah, and so I'll say one thing here, particularly with the objective standard of living, is that it's worth noting that this is not, that we are the first to have identified this, right? So in some of the Miracle of Microfinance and other papers in that volume, and then also in the Give Directly evaluation in Kenya, you do see these patterns where people who get grants to start businesses or loans to start businesses often reduce their spending, their consumption on their durable spending, which is consistent with saving up. But in the Haushofer and Shapiro paper on Give Directly, it's also interesting that you see people expand their businesses, and then that actually leads to a reduction in business profits. And so there's this tension where people may be saving up to expand their businesses, or it may be that they're expanding their businesses and they're not actually great at running a business. And so it might be making them a little bit worse off over time. So this idea that you might spend less on durables to save up for your business is not novel, but we're seeing it here 5 years out. And so it would be pretty weird, like the women in this program have spent their cash grants. So this is not consistent with, I got a cash grant and I need another 20% to be able to buy something, because we're still seeing negative effects on durables 5 years after receiving the grant. Okay, so this is great. I just have a few more minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit about beliefs. And hopefully this will kind of bring things together. So we, at the 2-year evaluation, we were interested in trying to understand to what extent the women who participated in the program had a sense of what the treatment effects of the program were. So there's this kind of methodological literature about whether program participants are good evaluators of the programs that they do. And Jeff Smith has done a bunch of work with different co-authors trying to talk about attempts to do this in the labor literature and how the questions that are asked are often quite inappropriate. So they give this example of the National Job Training Partnership Act, where they asked people whether they thought they got a better job or performed better because they did the program. And it can be very hard to map these questions to the types of things that we evaluate in impact evaluations. They're very open to social desirability bias, and it's not clear what the counterfactual is. And so they kind of give this advice on how you should be trying to ask questions about program impacts. And it's about kind of clearly specifying what the outcome is, the time period under evaluation, and making it clear how you would map that to a counterfactual. Okay, so we tried, so one example that they give is in the absence of this, what is the % chance that you would be operating a business? In our population, so whatever issues there are in a United States population, in our population, a big question with these counterfactuals is whether people know what percentages are. And this is particularly interesting in the Kenyan setting. I don't know how many of you have worked in Kenya, but the language is a huge issue. And so there is a Swahili word. Most of our surveys were in Swahili. There's a Swahili word for %, but nobody uses it. So if you use the Swahili word for %, people look at you and they're like, what are you doing? Do you mean %? And so you have to sort of mix in the appropriate, the words here to get at the concept. And even then we found, so we asked this kind of screener question, if there's a 25% chance of rain and 75% chance of sun, which type of weather is more likely? And we found that there was a decent sample of decent slice of the girls in our sample who couldn't answer this question correctly. And so using these percentages may or may not work in low education populations. And then the second issue that's plagued some of this work is this idea of hindsight bias. So basically, once you know something or you see yourself in a particular way, it can be very hard to imagine that it would have turned out differently. It can be very hard to imagine counterfactuals. And this is something, I thought I had a citation. So David McKenzie has some work on this where he's sort of tried to ask questions of this nature and seen that these own counterfactual questions seem to not necessarily get you back to the true treatment effect. So, oh, here we go. Here's my McKenzie citation. This is consistent. I don't know if any of you are on Twitter, but yesterday Rachel Meager was tweeting something about how whatever your idea is, David McKenzie has already done it, which I generally find to be the case. We have this question where we asked girls to think about a reference population of 100 women from their neighborhood. So not themselves. We also asked about themselves. We asked them to think about 100 women from their neighborhood who were similar age, et cetera. And then they either were selected to do the program or they weren't. And then we asked them how many of those women they thought would be operating their own business. And so we do this basically, we only do this in the control group. We only do this in the treatment groups, ask about both the treatment and the control, because obviously if you don't know what the program is, you can't say how many women it moved into self-employment. But this allows us to then calculate the estimate of the likelihood of self-employment in the treatment group and the comparison group based on the beliefs of these participants and to compare them. And so when we do this, what we see is that the women in the program have actually shockingly accurate beliefs about the treatment effect of the program on self-employment. And so over here, these are women assigned to the franchise treatment. The dark bar is the actual treatment effect. The light bar is their estimate of the treatment effect based on these two reference groups. And you see that they line up very, very closely. It's a little bit noisier when we look at treatment effects on paid work. They're sort of overestimating how big the shift out is going to be, but overall they're getting the kind of qualitative pattern and the magnitude of the effect pretty accurately. And so one of the things that we can take, actually one thing I want to show you about whether this is about levels or whatever. So when we just look at the levels, so this is not the treatment effect, but the differences we use to get the treatment effect, we see that those also line up quite well. But which is the slide that shows this? So what I want to show you is that when asked to, this is the franchise group's belief about the likelihood of self-employment. So when the people assigned to the GEM treatment are asked, what is the fraction of women who never did the program who are self-employed? Their estimate is very close to the actual probability. But what's interesting is that when you ask them to state their own counterfactual, so if you hadn't done the program, what is the likelihood that you would be self-employed? They are way, way off, exactly consistent with hindsight bias. So women in the franchise treatment know the fraction of women who didn't do the program who are self-employed, but they are very confident now that they were going to be self-employed. So they really overstate their own counterfactual. We see that that effect is much less pronounced in the grant treatment. So the grant treatment doesn't create this strong sense that you were going to be an entrepreneur ever anyway, which we think is interesting. And then we see that when we look at the impacts on paid work, it's interesting, the levels seem to be kind of systematically off relative to the beliefs seem to be systematically off relative to the actual levels, but in a way that is comparable between the treatment and the control groups. And we don't see this hindsight bias where they overstate the likelihood that they would be in paid work. Okay, so women who are assigned to the franchise treatment in particular, so women assigned to both treatments have relatively accurate beliefs about what these treatments are doing, that they're shifting people into self-employment to some extent out of paid work, but that is less of a large effect than the self-employment effect. So they do seem to have a strong sense of what these treatments are doing. So then this leaves us with a question of, why is it, if incomes aren't better, that women are choosing to remain in self-employment? And so it could be that this is just sticky, that they're kind of stuck, or it could be that the incomes are not better than being in another sector, but they like it better. So this is optimal from a utility perspective. And it could be that they're in it not because the incomes are higher today, but they think it puts them on a better trajectory. So in our 5-year follow-up, we asked a series of questions to try to disentangle this. And so we had this kind of vignette where we described women from their neighborhood that were the same age as them, and someone's getting help to start a business, another is getting help to find a job. It's challenging for both of them. Which one do you think is going to be doing better? And we said doing better overall, doing better in terms of the money they're making now and also in 5 years, and then which one is happier overall now and in 5 years. And so the first thing I want to show you, so we asked this at the 5-year follow-up of women in all 3 groups. And so the first thing I want to show you is that most of the women in our sample think that a person who gets help to start a business is going to be better off than a person who gets help to find a job. Okay, so this is over just about 80% in all groups, and we see that that's actually higher among those who were assigned to the franchise treatment, so those who themselves got help to start a business. When we ask who's better off in 5 years, we see that almost 90% of people in every treatment group seem to think that people who are self-employed are better off. We can break this down into happiness now and in the future and money now and in the future. And so the thing I would say here is that the self-employed women who did the franchise treatment are more likely to think that somebody who gets help to start a business is making more money now. But the big thing here is that for all of these treatments, for women in all 3 treatment groups think someone who gets help to start a business is going to be better off now and even better off in the future. And that's true about happiness. It's also true about money, but it's more, the estimates are higher when we think about happiness now in particular. And so we think that's some evidence to suggest that part of what's explaining the persistence of self-employment, even though the impacts on income seem to have disappeared, is just that women seem to prefer to be self-employed in this environment, conditional on having the same income in both sectors. Right. And so the overwhelming majority of women think that self-employed women are better off overall. They're going to be happier in the future. They're going to earn more in the future. And 91% of our respondents across all treatment arms said that if they could earn the same money, they would prefer to be self-employed. And so in that sense, it seems like both of these treatments, though they're not having persistent impacts on income, are in fact making women better off by some measure. But it's interesting that when we look at these measures of welfare, in fact, we see that those who had the more entrepreneurship focused program that potentially really built up their identity as entrepreneurs and created this sense that you were destined to be an entrepreneur seem to be have better welfare outcomes than those that were just given the cash to start a business. Okay.
What kind of paid work jobs that these women have in mind?
So I can tell you the kind of paid work jobs that these women do. And so the biggest categories are retail, like working in somebody's small shop, watching their small shop for them, working for someone who is selling food or a restaurant or something like that, or domestic service, so cleaning houses, being a house girl, doing laundry, things like that. They're overwhelmingly informal. And I would say that those three together are still less than half. So there's just like a huge array of what people are doing. So trash collection and like working as a dancer in a tourist hotel, doing the like Kenyan cultural dances for tourists, like all sorts of things that you would never think of when these women are doing those things. And so I would say very few of them have white collar jobs. I mean, these are women who don't have a secondary school certificate by and large. So very few of them, even at the 5-year, have white collar jobs or formal sector jobs. A few of them work in factories, but the big things are domestic work, retail, and food service. And so then the interesting thing, of course, is that with the exception of domestic work, they're very similar to the types of businesses that the women set up. Like, I'm not sure that the work is that different. What is mostly different is that you have to manage your own business in your own hours, but you have a lot of autonomy. Okay, so I think that's it. And I think I've kind of gone over, so I should stop now and take some questions. But thank you very much for listening to me. And I'm happy to take questions.
I ask a short question. It's about this variable, about understanding percentages. Mm-hmm. Have you looked at the potential role of that in terms of the heterogeneity of the results?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So let me show you. So basically what we did is we had this question and then we asked everybody a qualitative question. So if you understood percentages, we asked you then for the percent for your own counterfactual probability. If you didn't, we asked you, and in fact, we asked everybody basically to put yourself, like, how likely was it? Definitely wouldn't have happened, might have happened, but like less likely that it would happen, that it wouldn't, equally likely that it would and it wouldn't. So 5 categories. And so then you can see that here on the right, when we're looking at your own counterfactual, when we take the third of the women who only answered the qualitative question out, it actually doesn't change the estimate much at all. So we thought that it might be a thing about percentages, but in fact, I mean, and most of the women, when they give a percent, they don't say like 63, they say 10 or 25 or 50. And so using the qualitative question doesn't actually seem to change our estimates of the own counterfactual much at all.
Do women who understand percentages do better in their self-employment?
You know, that's actually a good question. So I'm not sure, you know, we have a whole bunch of stuff that, I mean, it's actually discouraging about how markets work. We have a whole bunch of things, particularly at, in the 2nd year, we did all of these like business skills, quizzing you on your knowledge of hair braiding and typing and all of these things. And they actually predict labor market outcomes really poorly, conditional on just, did you finish secondary school? So I'm not sure we've looked at whether you understood percentages, but overall, there's not a huge amount of evidence that, at least in this environment where it's just, have you found a job? I think it's more about your social network than about your actual skills.
I was wondering about, these girls, I mean, to a certain extent, I think you're implicitly saying that these girls are growing up earlier, probably, with the franchise. So they are empowered at an early age. So my question is maybe I missed something at some point because my connection is not so great today. But on the cash grant, is it possible that these cash grants are going for the family business instead of the girls' business? So do we have data about that? So that could be a source of big difference between the two, which could be the reason for persistence, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the cash grants are, I mean, the persistence in self-employment is basically the same for the cash grant and the program. Now, I would say, so one thing that's really challenging about this population is that there's so much, the women are moving from living with their parents to living with boyfriends and living with friends. So it's very hard to, like, there's just a huge amount of noise. If you think about, you can't define anything as, do household level analysis because the girls we're interested in are changing the compositions of their households a lot over this time period. And so I think we have some information about whether, like, most of these women, even at end line, are still not married. And so it isn't the case, like, this isn't the Erica Field story where you get the cash grant and your husband is like, no, I'm the better businessman, give me the money. And so in this case, like, that doesn't mechanically happen. Your dad could take the money. And some of them have a boyfriend, and I'm sure they face a lot of social pressure. But I think thinking about whether there are household outcomes is really complicated because we don't have a huge sample, and you have this potentially endogenous, like, we don't see treatment effects on household formation, but we don't have a lot of power. And so we can't also rule out that things about the composition of your household are impacted. And so it's hard to say, like, it's hard, we can't really say, like, this is the impact on husbands when women are endogenously deciding whether or not to get married all throughout this period, and very few of them start out married. And so I think it's, this goes back to the point, are they using the grants for the right thing? I don't know, and I don't even know what that means, because it could be that investing it in your spouse or your social network is good, either for efficiency reasons or because social networks are valuable. But other questions?
Thank you.
Maybe a small one on the definition of the take-up for the franchise treatment. I saw that the take-up was about 60%, but I was wondering, how do you define take-up exactly?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is tricky. This is actually when I teach treatment on the treated, I use this as an example of how it can go wrong, right? So what we use is, so the first part of take up is just administrative data on whether you show up for any business training classes, right? So if you never do the program, then, like, if you never even start the program, then you don't take up the program. Now we saw 60% do at least one day of business training, but only 40% actually do enough to be certified as finishing the training and given a business kit. So that's a second measure of take up. And then, we see that 40% start a business, but by a year out, only kind of 12% more than in the control group have a self-employment activity. So there are a variety of things in there that you could use to characterize the intensive margin of take up. Clearly, if you never go to the training at all, then you didn't take up the program. But I think it's tricky to think about treatment on the treated in that the only thing you can use as a take-up variable is whether you ever go, because going at all could have an effect on you. But it could definitely be the case that for people who go one day and never come back, the treatment effects are really muted. So even if we were to scale up our ITT to the treatment effect, the treatment on the treated that is kind of okay to do, that might be an understatement of how much it impacted the girls that really finished the program.
Yes, thanks.
I think you probably said this and I missed it, but like among the grantees who did end up self-employed, like, do we know how they did it? Like, did they buy the similar training? Did they buy themselves capital? Like, what did they do with the grant to get self-employed?
So they didn't go to vocational school. That's the short answer. So they generally bought themselves capital. What kind of capital? There's a huge amount. My favorite, my like Econ 101 example is the one who bought 100 plastic chairs and then rents them out. Like she just became a capitalist. And she rents them out for weddings and people pay her. But, you know, a bunch of people started some sort of retail thing, cart, small shop, you know, buying secondhand clothes to sell at the side of the road. There are lots of things like that. There are a few people who tried to start kind of a salon without any training, but mostly, you know, different kinds of petty trading activities are what they did. But there's a huge amount of heterogeneity, and we tried to go through and classify it, and it's like, you know, there's a lot of diversity in what they do.
Yeah. So like in terms of policy implications, like, am I right in thinking that like the answer is just like more access to capital for everyone, both like on the individual side, because people, you know, or sorry, more access to credit maybe, because if people have better loans, then they can buy this capital and buy their plastic chairs, which is a gorgeous example, by the way. And also kind of more access to credit on the firm side, because you can imagine these firms, like if they had better access to credit, then they could run these like franchisee recruitment programs themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say I don't think more access to credit is good. I mean, a couple of things I would say are that, one, I mean, this, like, I think there's less clarity on the policy implications than I might like, which is always the case. But, you know, we do see that this packaged program that kind of builds an identity as an entrepreneur at least seems to be better, like achieves the same labor market outcomes, but seems to be better in terms of subjective welfare at the same cost. So a little bit counterintuitively, that suggests that we shouldn't necessarily, like, it's not that cash grants are particularly bad. There are a couple of margins where they seem bad, but I think it suggests that we shouldn't be kind of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Like, active labor market interventions that relax credit constraints are good, but these other things, particularly for young people with limited experience that are helping to overcome other margins, may actually have some value. And in our case, it seems like they particularly have value, not in increasing income, but in increasing girls' confidence and sense of identity that they're in the right trajectory, they're in the right sector, which seems to have welfare implications. And it seems pretty clear that in all the groups, people like the idea of being self-employed. So I think that we should be less uncomfortable with the notion that microfinance and other things don't necessarily increase incomes, because if people are able, particularly people in these very risky and unpleasant informal labor markets, are able to be self-employed, and that gives them, you know, and they like that better, then even if the income effects are just zero, that's completely fine. You could have a negative treatment effect on income and it still would be welfare increasing. And so I think in that sense, it suggests that these interventions overall are good, but we shouldn't necessarily be just focusing on credit market interventions, because the life skills, the mentoring, we don't know exactly which one, but some of this seems to have changed girls' identity and their sense that they're doing the right thing with their life here.
That's a great summary, Pam. I will just ask a very quick question on this idea of flexibility. So maybe this is specific for these females and young females. Do you have any qualitative evidence on why do they value this flexibility? Is it because, I mean, they are raising a family and this is something that they value? Do you have any sort of even qualitative evidence on that?
So I'm sorry to say, in contrast to my own personal experience, it doesn't seem to be about the fact that you can bring your child to work or take your maternity leave. So we don't see any heterogeneity in terms of whether you have kids or childcare responsibilities at baseline. We don't see any impacts on the likelihood. I mean, we were actually really interested in this. We don't see impacts on the likelihood that you bring your kid to work. I think partially because if you have a small baby, most of the jobs that these women get, also, you can bring your baby on your back to watch somebody else's shop. And so it doesn't seem like that's it. And we did ask, I should go through the quotes. I mean, we asked a lot about what people thought was good or bad. And mostly the answers were that people had bosses who were jerks. And so they didn't like working for bosses who were jerks. And sometimes, I mean, it's interesting because sometimes people said they liked the autonomy, but other people said they actually disliked the autonomy, but they were sick of having bosses who were jerks.
Okay. I don't know if anyone else has questions. Otherwise, we'd like to thank you, Pam, for this wonderful, very interesting work that you presented. Okay, this was a great conclusion to our seminar series this semester. So yeah, we'll have some job talks in January, and then we'll be back. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been
everyone.
great. Thank you for all the wonderful comments. And I guess I'll see a few of you later on in the one-on-one meetings. But thank you very much. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas.
Happy holidays, everyone.